Hi everyone, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining our webinar again. Can you please give me a reaction on how you're doing right now? I see that a lot of you already filled up our Mentimeter, and it's been nice to see your funny comments. Um, Maybe while we wait for other participants to join in, I would like to read a few of your answers on today's sessions, especially you already joined the first one, which is breaking the silos, learning from different fields. Someone here said that capitalism rules everything, and someone actually responded to that, that it's so real, especially as a fresh graduate. You feel it. Can you all hear my voice clearly, or is it a little bit too low? Give me a thumbs up if I'm audible, or thumbs down if my voice isn't clear. Okay, okay, thank you. Someone said, I realized that in order for us to have a major change, we also have to move and change collectively with the same goal. Otherwise, it's hard to reach our goal. Yeah, maybe the session from like the gender and like sustainability um makes us see that we're all actually fighting in the same system, even if we use different terms or language. Okay, do we still have another slide? Okay, so I want to know your mood for today's session because we will have a lot of system mapping expert sharing with us. So, which part of today's session are you most excited about? Please, you can put it on the Mentimeter. For those who are wondering, we have shared the breakout room exercise materials on our WhatsApp group chat. So we will try to learn about problem framing, but that's after the keynote speakers shared their um, presentation. And then we will have another discussion as well, of course, if that's what we do. All right, so I can see that a lot of you are excited to hear our expert introduce us to system mapping or system thinking. Maybe with that being said, I believe that is the last of our Mentimeter session. For those who are here, please feel free to open your camera so we know that you're here and attending this webinar. And throughout the session, please feel free to be as interactive as possible. Keep the chat going. Feel free to ask questions or make little comments. But we also have made a little change to our Q&A sessions. So on the first session, we directly ask you to like type in the chat box, but right now we will use this link that you can just click. So whenever you think that you have any questions, you can just type in, and you can also do upvotes if you think that someone else's question is important to be answered. So it will come up at the top, and I will um, easily moderate it. And yeah, maybe without further ado, can we pull up the profile speaker to get to know our keynote speaker a little bit? So we have a really special guest speaker here. His name is James Stauch. He is actually the author of the 55 Minutes book. Maybe some of you already read it. Um, he is also already doing 20 years in the world of giving and social change. He helps students and communities learn how to lead with purpose, create real impact, and so on and so forth. But I don't want to waste your time. I believe we can learn more by hearing him speak from his presentation. So without further ado, James, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Inten. And I'll just pull up some slides here. Hopefully this works. Now you can see that okay. Oh, I'll put it in slide mode here.
Yep, it's visible.
Okay. So thanks, Inten. And thanks for Bridging Minds for inviting me to be part of this online gathering. So I am speaking today from Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and future territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So the colonial name for this place is Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, Canada. And I'm going to speak to you today about the importance of systems thinking and why our current problem-solving methods are inadequate. So, in the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report that they put out earlier this year, employers actually identified systems thinking as a core skill, not a nice to have, but a must have. When thinking about, well, what do we need in 2030? What do employers need? And what are they looking for in employees in 2030? But here's the thing, systems thinking isn't really a strong part of most school systems, whether you're talking about primary or secondary school, or most universities don't have a single course in systems thinking or in systems practice. So this is changing slowly. In my view, it's not changing quickly enough, just given the urgency of the times. So the book, who among us hasn't at some point said, the system is broken or the system is rigged, or the inequities that we experience in our world are what we typically describe as systems problems or systemic problems. Um, so as functioning systems either slowly crumble around us or they reveal themselves as no longer suitable for purpose for our current time, it can kind of make us feel numb and create a sense of disbelief and reduce our sense that we can do anything about it, our own sense of agency. Um, our own leadership abilities are affected, that we can sort of see these. Uh, how can we change such complex systems? And how can we even engage with complexity? And so the 55 minutes is what we call an atlas to navigate problems, reveal systems, and ask beautiful questions in a radically shifting world. So it's a compendium of mapping tools, of frameworks, concepts for those pursuing any kind of innovation. And whether that's commercial innovation, social innovation, policy innovation, but innovation, of course, never just happens in a vacuum or independently. The book helps you understand the broader context. So the nature, the depth, the origins, the potential futures and trajectories of the problem. Um, and that any kind of intervention, and that could include like student-led grassroots community initiatives, any kind of initiatives are trying to address amidst this context of complexity. Um, and it explores how you can kind of dig into the systems that produce the problem in the first place and that still hold that problem in place. So the book is already being used as a textbook for a lot of university and college courses in systems thinking, but it's also being used in other courses like public policy, design, entrepreneurship, and all of those kinds of courses and many others do explore problem solving and complexity. And so a lot of teachers, instructors have found that this is a helpful companion to have in doing that. By the way, you can download a free copy of the PDF at the55minutes.com. So you can obviously order the book too if you'd like a hard copy, but the PDF is free. Um, the title of its book takes its inspiration from a quote by Albert Einstein. Now, whether he actually said this is a matter of some dispute, but what he was alleged to have said is, if I was given an hour to solve a very difficult problem and my life depended on it, well, how would I use that hour? So he said, well, I would use the first 55 minutes of that hour just to think about the problem, just to ask questions about the problem, and only the last 5 minutes to do anything about it. But that is where most of our organizations, most of our institutions are all about the last 5 minutes. That's where the incentives lie, right? So that's where design exists, or strategy, planning, invention, venture creation, regulation, and other public policy interventions. Those are all last 5 minute strategies for the most part. So we argue that we live in what we call a solutions exhibitionist culture. We fall in love with our solutions, and then we lavish prizes and grants and government contracts on them before we really understand the scope, the scale, the depth, the nature, the true nature of the problem. Is this problem just a symptom of another problem or a deeper problem? So, this book is a culmination of many years of hands on experience, applied research in my career, which has included about a decade each in community development, in philanthropy, in academia. And these days, much of my work is actually in the private sector with something called the ATCO Space Lab, which is so ATCO is the publisher, the founder, the promoter of the book, and Space Lab is kind of their innovation laboratory. It was inspired by their involvement in the 1960s in developing the landing gear for the moon lunar landers as part of the Apollo project. So the founder of Space Lab, which is ATCO's executive VP and chief transformation officer, George Constantinescu, he writes in the foreword to the book that systems thinking trains us to notice what is typically ignored, to reframe, to zoom out, to reflect. In doing so, it equips us to ask questions that are not only more insightful, but are more transformative. In a world that urges us to move quickly, these tools are designed to help us think more deeply without sacrificing speed. They counter the most common excuse for shallow thinking, that there simply isn't time. With systems thinking, there is, because the cost of not thinking deeply is time lost to false starts, poor decisions, and unintended consequences. So whether you're a CEO, whether you're a social activist, a policymaker, or an aspiring policymaker, an economist, any kind of community or philanthropic leader, social workers, entrepreneurs, investors, risk managers, the list goes on and on. Those are among the kinds of careers who can become much greater at their jobs if they incorporate systems thinking. So Echo was really getting tired. I mean, you might be thinking, and I saw a couple of comments about like, part of the system is we are completely surrounded by capitalism and capitalist norms and I would argue a particular kind of capitalism where um, short-termism is a really key feature. So there's a lot of like worrying about short-term shareholder value in most companies. Not every company. If you're a family-controlled company, it's a little different. If you are controlled by, say, employees, it's different. If you're controlled by uh, a, a charitable foundation such as Lego or IKEA, it's different. Or if you're in a context that's heavily regulated so that the governance of the company is quite different, such as Germany, for example, where employees have to be on the board. All of those are different flavors of capitalism, and some are serve longer term interests better than others do. So ADCO was getting frustrated with hiring young, really talented people out of school, regardless of their field of study. So they would hire engineers or lawyers or new scientists or social scientists or communications people. And they noticed that young people feel this kind of informal cultural pressure to come up with a solution. And so they came to this conclusion that we're creating generations of what you could call solutionaries or certainty junkies, heropreneurs. Um, and actually, one of our book reviewers, Pascal Finette, who worked for years in Silicon Valley and more recently wrote a book called Disrupting Disruption, he remarked that the 55 minutes as a book is what he called a radical act of necessary defiance against the innovation theater that prioritizes superficial fixes over real change. And so he says, it forces this crucial pause, the deep dive into understanding the actual problem before we waste precious energy and time on superficial fixes. So whether we work in the private sector, in government, in civil society, even in certain parts of academia, we tend to be encouraged to like join pitch competitions or hackathons or design sprints and kind of pinch or hack or design sprint our way to rapid solutions without this consideration of the problem. But a premature hack or too quick a sprint is not a recipe for failing forward. It's just a recipe for failing. There's also some really interesting analysis around culture and creativity. There's a scholar, Kyung Hee Kim, who wrote this amazing work on tracking the declining creativity in the United States, beginning in the 1990s. And she observed that children and students are spending far more time with each passing decade problem solving than problem finding. And she notes that it's in the discovery and the explanation of problems that creativity lies, right? So innovation itself cannot exist without creativity. And so if everything is about solutionism, in a context of complexity, all it ends up being is veneer, not substance. And so, the other thing to keep in mind is like every problem that we have today is a result of some system. And this will be true tomorrow. Whatever solutions we come up with today, or whatever new systems we design, will produce the problems of tomorrow. And often these are unanticipated. So there's a common systems archetype called fixes that fail that we talk about in the book. And it's when a problem appears on the surface for a period of time to be fixed or to be solved. But over time, the fix itself leads to these unforeseen or unanticipated new problems. So this either can worsen the original problem um, because of a feedback loop, a reinforcing feedback loop that's created, or the fix leads to more of the problem, or creates an entirely new problem. So often with these things, there's a time delay. And the time delay might be years, it might be decades, it might even be centuries. So we may not actually be able to detect or notice the failure right away. So an example we use in the book is, humans invented CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, as a solution to fatal accidents that were actually caused by early generations of refrigerants used in refrigerators, air conditioners, and so on. Um, and we did, but so it seemed to solve a problem. But we didn't anticipate that it would cause a catastrophic hole in the ozone layer. There was certainly some testing that went on at sort of like human atmospheric levels, but they didn't test thoroughly enough or for a long enough period of time or with enough of a broader group of chemicals. And so, of course, over time, we see that the hole in the ozone layer was being created. And by the way, this could have wiped out life on Earth had the international community not mobilized in time. This was a legitimately existential threat. Um, and then we came up with a new solution, HCFCs, or hydrochlorofluorocarbons. Now, that's an ozone safe, we think, replacement that we didn't anticipate, though, would be among the most powerful and the fastest growing greenhouse gases emitted globally. So now we have this powerful chemical that solved our ozone problem, but it's created or it's added to this problem of climate change. Um, the origin story for the book, by the way, lies in a global systems mapping competition for students that was created to combat this same sort of innovation theater trend in universities. And so my co-author of the report, Daniela Pappy Thornton, she created this competition when she was the director of the Scholes Center at the University of Oxford. And strangely, in those first few years, we observed that most of the schools that were participating in Map the System, these were universities, colleges worldwide, they didn't actually have a faculty lead or mentor or coach or even somebody on staff at the university. So it meant that students themselves were like raising the funds to participate in this competition, and students were kind of finding their own way into this. Um, and so we created a guide, an open access guide to help those students who were kind of orphaned, who didn't have faculty guides or mentors. And then we just put it out into the world, and we started getting really interesting feedback. People were saying, like they would phone us up from governments or from NGOs, and they would be saying, "Hey, we use this student guide. We just kind of ignore the bits that are part that are for students, but we really find this useful in our own policy labs, for example." So they're like, well, hey, when are you putting out a guide for practitioners? And so we started the book's life as literally a systems um, mapping guide for practitioners. And then we realized, well, nobody's going to buy that book. Like, that sounds really boring. So that's where what led us down to the 55 minutes. So it's basically the book itself is divided into a whole section we call foundations. So there's a whole set of competencies that are kind of foundational. You've probably learned a lot about these competencies already in your previous workshops or sessions. Um, and then I'm just going to zero in on one of these chapters. It's chapter 3. We don't have time to go into it, but chapter 3 basically uh, reveals a number of or explores a number of key competencies in systems practice or in systems thinking. Each of these have a descriptor, an example from the real world, an interesting anecdote, to try and bring these concepts to life. And so that you can recognize them in your own work, in your own thinking, in your own classes. So a lot of people have given us, students have given us feedback that the book in general, but this section in particular, really helps them draw connections between different courses in their university experience, where they're like, it's almost like it's the glue that or the sinew that sort of connects the gaps in between courses, and helps make sense of that. We have a whole section on complexity. I'm not going to go into much detail about this other than to say, like, all of our problems that we deal with, whether these are financial or economic or public policy challenges or social challenges, they exist in this kind of middle realm between um, the very ordered state of the cosmos. You can predict, for example, the next solar eclipse a few hundred years into the future, right down to the exact minute. And that's incredible. That's like a clockwork universe. It's not exactly a clockwork universe, but for all practical purposes, it functions that way. And then on the other side of the spectrum, to the very tiniest things that we understand, the quantum realm, in a way, it appears ordered, but it's actually disordered, but it's predictable. It's all about probability at that level. And then in the middle, in between the highly ordered and the highly disordered, is this complex world that we live in. And literally everything. I mean, you walk outside and you observe if you're living in a city, your transit system, the city itself, the country, which is a social construct. Everything that we worry about, whether these are family issues, whether these are organizational issues, uh, whether these are about geopolitics, um, the potential for wars and conflicts and so on. These are all in the realm of complexity. So, we say complexity really is the way of the world. And yes, the world is getting more complex in certain ways. There are more people. We know more about each other. There's, social media platforms, there's the internet. We know things in real time. So, in the past, we could sort of like only we can, our world appeared smaller. And so our brains are becoming a little bit more overwhelmed with this complexity, but also, and this is really important, the Western modern way of viewing problems and approaching problems is also, we argue, not helpful. It doesn't equip people well for complexity. And so we need to rediscover and reawaken and support other ways of knowing or other ways of understanding reality that are not specifically Western modern ways. And so, for example, in my part of the world, in Mi'kmaq territory where I live, there's a concept called two-eyed seeing, where one eye sees the world in a very Western way. Everything is like boxes, compartments, disciplines, organizations, binaries. Everything can be understood through some kind of coded, either language or coded meaning. Everything is quite ordered and supposedly orderly. And that's how sort of one side of your brain or one eye can see. And the other side that we don't trust as much is the side that worries about context and understands flow and understands connection and understands that what is around the corner is emergent, is not fully predictable. And in a way, there's an evolutionary base to this, right? That we have one side of our brain that must have a sort of predatory capacity. We must understand the difference between a rock and or a pebble on the ground and a seed that's edible. And so we need to have that fine distinguishing capacity and that categorization. But on the prey side, we're also some other animals' prey, or at least we were. And that requires a whole different set of capacities. We have to sort of grasp and be ready for the unknown unknowns, things that could come and try and eat us. But what that means in reality is, things that it translates to essentially, are we afraid of change or are we willing to embrace change? Because that is the way of the world. Once you dig into this is super interesting stuff, right? Like everything is connected to everything. Everything is a system. All systems are connected. We are all connected. Like everything, but we're not comfortable with that one-eyed way of seeing. We really are comfortable with kind of like the more the particular eye that governs the way our education systems tend to work. Now, I'm saying this not knowing anything about the education systems in Southeast Asia. And so it could be that you are way further along in this respect and that have incorporated all of these different ways of knowing already. But I'm just saying, in North America, this is not the case. Um, I know we're at the half hour. I know we started a bit late. Inten, how much more time do I have?
You can take your time. Sarah just told me she's okay if you take more time. Yeah.
Okay,
So
okay. I'll just take a few more minutes. We have this one exercise called hanging up your solution, that is basically like everyone is in love with an idea, usually. If you're passionate about a topic, you're probably also passionate about some way of dealing with that topic. So maybe it's poverty or food security that you're passionate about, and you might be in love with the idea of a universal basic income. And so put these ideas, we ask people to actually put them on paper, and we fold up the paper into an origami t-shirt and we hang it up during the duration of the workshop. Notice that we don't throw it in the garbage or we don't burn it. We're not saying the idea is bad or wrong or doesn't have a place. We're just saying don't fall in love with your idea too quickly because we got to make sure that we really understand the nature of the problem. What is the problem here? And maybe that idea comes in again, but maybe you completely reframe. Um, and so one of the things we notice is that like your decision to get involved in something or to be passionate about something is always where you start, right? We always the whole point of getting involved in solving a problem is that you care about the problem. That is a subjective journey. That's like what matches with your values. But we're always tempted to go straight to, and I value these kinds of outcomes or these kinds of interventions. But if you do that, that's kind of an empty calorie sandwich. So if you go from subjective to subjective without any attempt at objective in between, it's empty calories. It's innovation theater. So what we're trying to do is say, let's fill that sandwich with nutrient-rich content. And you will never, by the way, you will never have an objective understanding of a problem or a system, but you can get closer. You can at least increase the resolution. And that's really what the 55 minutes aims to do. So we've taken this sort of 55 minutes metaphor in the book. I'm not going to go into this in any detail at all, other than to say each of these chapters represents a kind of increment on an analog clock to make up 55 minutes. So that's how we've organized the book. So, we have a whole framing chapter where we ask the question, like, where do we focus? How do we set boundaries around the problem? Like, how can you actually like have a handle on it so you're not like just looking at all of the different systems that connect to it and all of those systems and all of those systems? How do you actually like put a frame around it? And by the way, you make the frame. It's not given to you. Like, no two people on this call will define a healthcare system the same way, right? What's in, what's out? Well, we might agree that hospitals are part of a healthcare system, but what about farms? What about um, exercise? What about gyms? What about bike paths? What about um, our households? And what about our parents? What about, like there's many things that go into health. Landscape is the second chapter, and that's who's already out there trying to address the system. What does the current landscape, the contours of the system look like? So there's actually a lot of different landscape metaphors that are really helpful for understanding how systems tend to stay frozen in place, or when they shift, that they can shift dramatically and suddenly. They don't generally sit comfortably on the edge of chaos, even though that's where a lot of innovation happens. Roots, what's beneath the surface? How can we dig down a little bit and try and see what's invisible? What about the origins? How did this even come to be a problem in the first place? So we look at history. We look at the future. We look at like the future history. Where might we be going if we did nothing about this problem? Or where might we be going if we imagined that the problem didn't exist at all? Uh, Experience. How is the system experienced by those within it? These could be the intended beneficiaries of a given system, like patients in a healthcare system, or they could just be people working in that system or interacting with it in some way. Relationships, this is important. Who's involved? How are they connected? Power, this takes relationships to the next level. Like who of those relationships and what kinds of those bonds hold particular power in a system? Where do the incentives lie? who benefits from the system being the system the way it is. Like if the system isn't changing, there's a reason. There's somebody who stands to benefit from the status quo. Um, Causality. This is kind of the logic of the system. So this is where we explore things like feedback loops, um, stock and flow, those kinds of concepts. That's more traditional systems mapping. And some would say this is the only category that's legitimately systems mapping if you're a very systems mapping purist. But we say, well, no, any kind of way of understanding and trying to visualize or diagram a system is actually a form of mapping. Narrative. This is really important. This is like what ways of thinking hold a problem in place? What stories do we tell ourselves, and that we might not even recognize hold this thinking in place? And then finally, leverage. And leverage is like where in the system might change be possible. Um, and so that's the 55 minutes. Uh, we do have an action chapter at the very end, but it's not a guide to action. It simply asks a bunch of questions about the 55 minutes again. Um, so that first framing section, where to focus the boundaries, etc. In there, we use two tools. One's from USAID called a 5 Rs framework, and one is out of an Australian university, the Griffith Center, that's called the Problem Framing Canvas. And in many ways, if you only use one tool in the book, and there's 30 tools altogether, this problem framing canvas is a good one if you have an hour or 2 hours just to kind of quickly sketch out what is the nature of the problem? What are the kind of the questions that I should be paying attention to? The problem framing canvas is a really great tool. It borrows heavily from other tools, and each of these boxes has there's at least one or two or three other tools in the book that kind of expand out each one of these boxes. But if you don't have a lot of time, or if you want to just start on your journey, the Problem Framing Canvas, which is still an open access resource, definitely check it out. Okay, I'll stop there. If there's time for questions, happy to take any questions.
Yes, if anybody wants to ask questions directly to James, please raise your hand, or we can also share screen the link that I just sent. Um, we have some questions from the website, the link that we use. Okay, so we got like the most upvoted questions from someone here. Um, they said our economy rewards profitable innovation rather than solving real problems, and system thinking seems like a lot of work. How does the
Hmm.
private sector utilize it? Yes.
Yeah, there are case studies going back as far as the 1970s of certain large companies using certain systems techniques. So, for example, some of that causality mapping involving elaborate feedback loops, stock and flow diagrams, scenario planning, the kinds of stuff you would see in the Club of Rome's uh, report that came out in what, 1973, I believe, which was an early attempt at modeling the world system and saying, at what point are we going to deplete resources in a way that's going to be very difficult for society to recover from? And so those techniques that came out of MIT in Boston were deployed in certain corporate settings. So Shell, for example, did a bunch of scenario work based on that early systems dynamics modeling. Um, and Procter and Gamble was another company who did that. But um, with the way Atco uses it, and the way why they embrace it is they're a family-controlled company. They are publicly traded, but family owns the majority of shares. And the reason they do it is for legacy. They're like, most companies don't think they need to think in systems because they don't actually care about their own longevity. You might think they do, but they don't explicitly for the most part. And so that's an interesting question. If you're a company that assumes, and by the way, there was research that came out a couple weeks ago that said most CEOs, 60% of CEOs don't expect their own company to survive the next decade. Can you imagine that? I mean, you're responsible for this company, and it's normal in that in across many different industries to not expect your company to be around. So the modus is let's maximize profits as quickly as we can. And if the company goes off a cliff or gets sold to somebody else, well, that's success too. We can all cash out. The trouble is, if you're in a family run company or some other structure that's a little more interesting, often a little more democratic, um, those structures require that the company or are very interested in the company being around 20, 30, 100 years from now. Well, what do you have to do to ensure that a company is going to be around in 50 or 100 years? You have to be keenly aware of social trends, cultural trends. You have to set up that so-called requisite variety, the amount of diversity that needs to be in your company or institution, because some parts of the company will not survive. Some may, if you have enough diversity, if you have enough ways of working or possible states. And so if you look at, well, which institutions have survived the longest? In a European context, it would be universities and the Catholic Church. And both those institutions are good examples of creating requisite variety, meaning there are different faculties, there are different institution types, there are different pedagogies, there are different, in the church's case, there are different orders, there are different sub belief systems, there are different emphases based on different traditions. And so these institutions are much more resilient and resistant to external shocks than a company where everyone is swimming in the same stream, reading from the same song sheet. And so it's highly relevant to the private sector. It's just that much of the private sector doesn't realize it's relevant. So that's the way ATCO approaches it. They also, by the way, they're like, if you embrace systems thinking and complexity and act accordingly, you can also do a better job at attracting the brightest young minds. People don't want to be working in a boring context. They want to be working in an exciting context where change is embedded in the organizational culture.
Okay, thank you, James. I hope it answers your question, whoever wrote that. The second one, are there any problems in status quo that are already solved with system thinking, or is this entirely a new method?
Yeah, I would say nothing is solved with systems thinking. Systems thinking is just another way of revealing understanding um, of a particular problem so that you have a better chance of addressing that problem in a way that is more durable, more sustainable, likely to have effects that are that last longer. So I'll give you an example in the social policy context. At the end of the Second World War in Canada, Canada had some of the lowest or the highest rates of poverty among senior citizens, older adults, in the OECD. And it was a real problem. The attempts to address it included meal programs, included things like food banks for seniors, it included um, attempts to create community gardens. All of these things maybe had some small benefit, but it was not until there was a sufficient examination of the deeper system, which was seniors living in poverty and seniors not having any source of income, not being employed anymore, not being in the workforce. And eventually, the Canadian state figured out that if it created both an old age security program and a pension program that was universal, that it would achieve success with that. And indeed, and it took many decades to fully implement because, like, first of all, you have to have, if it's a pension program, people have to pay into the pension program, they have to work long enough. And so old age security came in the late 50s, followed by the Canada Pension Plan. But by the 90s, the early 90s, Canada had the lowest senior citizen poverty rate in the OECD. It was down to about 2%, from a high of, I think, 37, 38% just after the Second World War. So there's an example where if you took the time to examine and get your head around the deeper causes of that problem, you have a better chance at success. It may be in this case it was more expensive, but it actually in the long run wasn't more expensive because you kept seniors out of hospital for longer. You kept seniors out of other kinds of as state-run or charitable facilities. And in the end, it cost society a lot less to run a national old age security and pension program than it does to do the alternative. You could see a version of this in Denmark today, where Denmark operates a really powerful home care program that is a universal program. It, in the end, Denmark pays far less per senior for care than countries that rely on institutional long-term care facilities. So that's also a very interesting, but there are many reasons why we are afraid to jump into a Danish style system. Partly because it may or may not work here. Like just because it works in Scandinavia doesn't necessarily mean it works here. So you have to ask those questions too. You can't just be drawn to the shiny solution without really properly trying small prototypes, small experiments, small pilots in your own context.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we still have more questions, but I don't think the time allows it. So if anybody still want to ask question or still curious, please reach James through his email. He already dropped it in the comment box. But thank you so much for the insights. I believe this is the first introduction to system thinking to most of the people in this call. So I hope it's gonna be helpful from them for them. Maybe if you have another activity to do, please leave this Zoom call. But if you want to say like a couple of words to like close your session, I will give you like a little bit more time, James.
Great. Thank you so much. And I won't cut into your time any further other than to say, do check out the 55minutes.com for a free download of the book. Uh, we just scratched the surface today. So, and I know there's some really great questions in the dialogue. I think most of those questions, if not all of them, would be addressed in the book. So we have sections, for example, on like, well, what's the relevance of this to very specific fields? Like if you're in government, what's the relevance there? Or if you're in risk management, or if you're in investment. And then we also get into like a lot more detail around like fixes that fail or uh, examples of unintended or unforeseen consequences. And so I think you'll find that, when you dig into it, and by the way, don't read it cover to cover. Read the parts that are just interesting to you. That's why we kind of call it an atlas, is to say, yeah, there's a bunch of maps in here, but it's not really like it's not meant to be read cover to cover. Use it as a reference. So anyway, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Really think it's so cool that you're embedding systems thinking into a leadership program. I think it's a really core 21st century leadership skill, as do a bunch of other employers. So, yeah.
All right, thank you so much for your generosity for sharing with us. But yeah, unfortunately, we have to move to our next speaker, who are also as inspiring and as insightful as James. So yeah, thank you so much, James. You're allowed
Take care,
to.
everyone. Good luck with the rest of the sessions.
Thank you. So yeah, moving on to our second speaker to deep digger into the system mapping, we have Sarah Rifki Ardani. You already met her during the first session. She is the Ag System Mapping Student Forum lead at Wesleyan University. Maybe without further ado,